Chapter 10, in which Tom gives Green a bit of advice, which, aided by a storm, is not without its effect. On the afternoon of the following day, Tom, Harry, and Alexander Jones were engaged in an earnest consultation. "I don't think he'd allow it," said Harry. "What do you think, Alec?" asked Tom. "I'd be afraid to ask," responded Alec. "Well, he can't more than refuse, and I guess I can stand that. Yes, fellows, I'm going to ask." And without further ado, Tom walked over towards Mr. Middleton, who was acting as umpire in a game of handball between Donnell and Keenan. "Well, Tom," said the prefect, as he caught the anxious eyes of our hero fixed upon him, "what do you want?" "If you please, sir, I'd like permission to take a walk with Harry Quip and Alec Jones." "Certainly. You are all on the good conduct list. Be back in a half an hour before supper." "And, Mr. Middleton, can't Johnny Green come along with us?" "He is not on the conduct list. You know the rule." "Yes, sir, but he hasn't had a chance to go out since the first week of school." "That's not a sufficient reason for his going out now." "But, Mr. Middleton, yesterday you told me you'd make it all right with me for carrying over the bedclothes and things. Let Green come along, and I can't ask for anything I'd like more. You know, sir, we haven't been friends up to yesterday." And Tom gazed at the prefect wistfully. "Tom," answered Mr. Middleton after a few moments of consideration, "please tell Green that I'm very glad to have an excuse for letting him out, and that I hope he'll have all the privileges of the conduct list next month." "Thanks, Mr. Middleton. I know every word you said just then by heart, and I'll tell it to him exactly as you said it." And touching his cap, Tom hurried away. "Say, Green, won't you take some candy?" he inquired of that young gentleman, whom he found engaged in furtively carving his name on a corner of the little boy's building. Green closed his knife very promptly, and accepted the candy with silent enthusiasm. "How'd you like to take a walk with me, Green, and with Quip and Jones?" "I'd like well enough to take a walk with anybody," came the rough answer, "but I'm not allowed outside this wretched yard." And Green went on to express his injured feeling in a manner too realistic for reproduction. "You needn't swear about it anyhow," interrupted Tom, "and besides, Mr. Middleton has given you permission." Green opened his eyes. "What?" he gasped. Tom repeated Mr. Middleton's message. "Just my luck," observed Green, gazing ruefully at the letters he had cut. "If he sees those initials, I'll lose my conduct card again. I can't behave to save myself." Tom pulled out his own knife and forthwith began working upon Green's carving. "There," he said presently. "If anyone can make J.G. out of that now, he'll have to be pretty smart. Come on, Johnny. We'll have a fine walk." Accordingly, the four were soon seen outside the college grounds, an event which Green celebrated by putting a huge quid of tobacco in his mouth. It was a gloomy afternoon. The morning had opened with a black mass of clouds low upon the eastern horizon. With the progress of the day, they had been accumulating and spreading westward, growing thicker and blacker in their advance, till nearly half of the firmament was now veiled from the eye. "That's an ugly sky," observed Harry. "There's lots of wind in those clouds," added Tom. "It looks as though we'd have a big storm tonight." "So it does," assented Alec, who did little else in ordinary conversation beyond contributing the scriptural yea and nay. "I ain't afraid of storms," said Green. "There's nothing wonderful about that," commented Tom. "What would you be afraid for?" "Some fellows get scared when they hear the thunder," exclaimed Green, "but I don't mind it one bit." "I do," said Alec. "When the thunder begins and I'm in bed, I always put my head under the blankets and pray." "That's 'cause you're a coward," said Green loftily. "I don't fear going to bed in the dark nor nothin'." "In other words," remarked Quip, with a solemn roll of his big eyes, "you aren't afraid of anything." "Nah, I ain't afraid of nothin'." "You're not afraid to blow, that's sure," put in Tom in a matter-of-fact tone. "All the same, Johnny, I rather think you'd be scared if you knew you had to die right off." "I don't know about that," answered Green. "I don't expect to go to heaven anyhow." "You don't?" "Nah, I gave up trying to be good long ago." "At least you might try to make the first 9 Fridays that Father Nelson talked to us about in the chapel," suggested Tom. Green stared at him heavily. "He said, you know," continued Tom, "that there's a promise of grace to die well for any fellow that makes 'em." "I heard him, but once a month is too often for me." "Just think," added Harry Quip, "tomorrow's the first Friday in November. Make a start, crazy. It won't hurt you to try." "I guess I'll not begin yet," answered Green as he proceeded to roll a cigarette. "It would please Mr. Middleton a heap," Tom observed. "Yes, indeed," put in Alec. "And it would do you any amount of good," added Tom. "Come on, Johnny. You sneaked out of going to communion last time the boys went. You needn't stare. I had my eyes open, and I saw you dodging. It's my opinion that you've been dodging ever since you came back to college." "Say, you didn't tell on me, did you?" "Not yet," answered Tom diplomatically. He had never entertained the idea of reporting Green to the authorities, "and I won't mention it either. Now, you'll go tomorrow, won't you?" There was a short silence. "Yes," answered Green at length, and speaking with an effort. "I'll go." Making their way through the woods which girded the river, they presently arrived at a clearing upon the bank. "Isn't it growing dark awful fast?" exclaimed Harry. "Just look at those clouds. They're beginning to move faster and faster, and they're coming our way, too," cried Tom. "Let's run home," suggested Green. Borne on the wings of the storm, the dark masses in the east were advancing gloomily, rapidly, like a marshaled army. The wind which carried them on could be faintly heard, breaking upon the dread silence which had come over the scene round about them, as the ticking of a watch at midnight upon a nerve-shattered invalid. Fascinated by the sweep of the clouds, they stood, these little boys, with their eyes lifted towards the heavens. "Ah!" This exclamation, which seemed to break from all simultaneously, was evoked by a sudden change in the moving panorama. For as they stood gazing, there dropped from the bosom of these clouds thin dark veils reaching from earth to sky. "What is that?" cried Green. "I don't know, I'm sure," answered Tom. "I never saw anything like that in St. Louis. Maybe it's rain moving this way. Anyhow, the storm will be on us in a moment. Just look how it's rushing towards us. It's too late to start for the college. Where'll we go?" As they set about answering the question, the clouds came nearer and nearer. The whistling of the breeze that one moment before had seemed but to emphasize the silence had risen to an angry scream. The 4 lads, wavering and irresolute, not knowing whether they should go for shelter, presented a striking tableau as they paused there in the open. Tom stood with his legs apart, firmly braced. His hands were clasped behind his back, and with his hat tilted so as to show the shock of his thick black hair over his forehead, and his mouth pursed as though he were about to whistle, he raised his eyes in an unblinking gaze upon the angry clouds. Next him was Alec, pale, silent, with an awe-stricken look upon his fair face. He had put his arm through Tom's, and clung to our little friend as a drowning man to a plank. Tom was Alec's hero. Harry Quip was on the other side of Tom, the usual grin still lingering upon his merry face, and his hand thrust deep in his pockets. Green, who stood in advance of these, had become intensely pale. His fingers were quivering, his breath came in gasps, and he glanced over and over from sky to companions, and from companions to sky. The first drops of rain began to patter about them, and while the wind, keeping time with them with the moment of the rain, sent the trees before them bowing and swaying in a weird dance, all the more weird for the unnatural darkness that had fallen upon all nature. "Hadn't we better run?" asked Tom. "Yes," said Green eagerly. "Come on." "I'm afraid I can't, Tom. I can't run," said poor Alec. "I feel weak and dizzy, and I'm so frightened." "Harry and John, go ahead," said Tom. "I'll stay with Alec." "No, you don't, Tom," said Quip. "You stay, I stay." "Come on, Quip," implored Green. "They can look out for themselves." "Go on yourself," said Harry, speaking with some asperity. "You can take care of yourself if you want to." "I don't want to be alone in this storm." "Then stay here," came the curt answer. "Hello!" cried a voice. Why, you're smart boys for your age. You've chosen about the safest place around here." And John Donnell, out of breath with running, emerged from the woods and placed himself beside Green. "We came near running anyway," said Tom. "We thought we could run through the woods and find some house to stay till the storm blew over. We're mighty glad to see you, John." "It's lucky you stayed here. If the wind gets any worse, the woods will be a dangerous place. Flying branches and lightning and what not." During this conversation, short as it was, rain and wind had grown worse. "Ugh, we'll be drenched to the skin," said Tom. "Why, hello," he added. "Alec is sick." Alec had pillowed his face on Tom's bosom, and before the exclamation was well out of his mouth, the poor child had fainted. "Here, give me the boy," shouted Donnell. Shouting had now become necessary in the ordinary tone of conversation. "I'll fix him in a trice." And John, as he spoke, took Alec in his arms, carried him to a soft bit of earth, and depositing him gently, threw open his collar. "Hello, Green! What's the matter?" bawled Tom, attracted by the strange motions of the frightened boy. "I can't stand here. I've got to run," came the answer. Donnell raised his face. "Stay where you are," he said sternly. "If you want to die young, run through those woods." As he ceased speaking, there came a dazzling flash of lightning, followed almost instantaneously by a terrific clap of thunder. With a wild cry, Green dashed for the woods. "Stop him, Tom!" cried Donnell, jumping to his feet. "Stop him! He's lost his wits!" Donnell, though many yards in the rear of both, had set forward in hot pursuit. As for Tom, he scarcely needed Donnell's bidding. Green had not fairly made a start when Tom was at his heels. Terror, as they say, lends speed, but poor Green seemed to be an exception to this, as to many other rules. He slipped several times, and once was within a little of losing his balance and falling to the earth. Indeed, it seemed as though Tom, who was running at his best, would catch him before he reached the woods. But as Green drew nearer to the dangerous shelter, he regained something of his customary speed, and Tom, who had thus far gained upon him, began to lose his advantage. Donnell, meanwhile, was lessening the distance between himself and Tom at every step. At length Green, in passing a tree that stood like a sentinel, guarding the main body of the woods, slipped again, and before he could recover himself, Tom had come within 5 feet of him. Then, just as the thoroughly frantic boy broke into his regular speed, Tom sprang into the air, alighted on Green's back, and bore him into the ground. And while they were still rolling upon the drenched earth, there was a sharp crack, like the report of a pistol discharged at one's ear, a strange swishing sound, a crash of many branches beating against each other, and 20 feet before them there came the crashing to the earth of a giant oak tree. As it fell, a twig struck Tom in the face. In an instant, though dazed and bewildered, Tom had sprung to his feet, but Green rose only to his knees. He was quivering with fear and beat his breast. "Spare me! Spare me!" he cried. "I'll go to confession this very night." "Get up, will you?" bawled John Donnell, his voice rising high above the noises of the elements, as he caught Green by his shoulders and dragged him to his feet. "If you don't move away from here, you'll not have a chance to make a confession." And without further words, John dragged him back into the open. Tom followed quietly. Even his face, it must be said, had paled a trifle. And there they stood, motionless as statues, silent and awed for 2 or 3 minutes. There they stood till they saw the swiftness of its might. The wind had flown by them, till the clouds had moved on to the western horizon and left the sky above them perfectly clear, till, in fine, the storm had ceased with a suddenness befitting its violence. "Well, it's over and all is well," said John Donnell. "I guess we better run for the college, John," put in Tom, "and change our things, or we'll get rheumatism or smallpox or something ugly. What's the matter, Green?" Green pointed a quivering finger at the western sky. "It's coming back. Those clouds have stopped moving." "I guess we can beat 'em," answered Tom. "John, I'm awful glad you came. We'd have lost our heads if it hadn't been for you. How'd you come to be around?" "I was hunting for snakes with Keenan, and we got separated. You can rely upon it that George is safe in the college by this time. Now, boys, run for home. Are you all right, Alec?" "Yes, sir," said Alec, who had risen to his feet while the race between Green and Tom had been going on. "But I'm afraid I can't run very fast." "Here, put your arm through mine," said John. And your other arm through mine, added Tom, whose color had fully returned. In a very short time, indeed, they were changing their garments in the dormitory. Green uttered not a word till he was about to leave the room. Then he said, Tom, if you hadn't jumped on my back and pulled me over, I'd be dead now. Ugh. Yes, replied Tom, adjusting his tie with more than wonted precision. And if you hadn't tumbled over with me, I'd have been killed too. I was scared that time, I can tell you. But of course, you weren't scared. Tom grinned as he waited for an answer. Scared? I should think I was. Say, Tom, I was lying to you fellows about my not being afraid. You needn't tell us that, said Tom bluntly. But I'm going to change. See if I don't. And Green left the dormitory and went straight to the chapel, leaving Tom and Alec alone. Well, Alec, began Tom, who divined from the timid lad's face that he wished to say something, do you feel shaken? A little, Tom. Did you hear what Green said just after the storm? What did he say? He said it was coming back. Oh, well, he was most scared, out of his wits. Tom, it is coming back. Nonsense. Well, I feel as though something were about to happen. Won't you please pray for me? And Alec caught Tom's hand and gazed into his countenance with a sweet pathos inexpressibly touching. A beautiful face it was that met our heroes, none the less beautiful for the modesty which nearly every minute of the day veiled the cheeks and sent the blood purpling to the pale cheeks. Now, however, Alec's eyes were wide open and fixed oh so appealingly upon Tom's. And Tom, as he returned the gaze, was impressed with something which he could not define, but which brought home to him for the first time that he was in the presence of a boy of extraordinary holiness and purity. Why, of course I'll pray for you, if you want me to. What's up? Tomorrow, Tom, I finish making the first 9 Fridays. Well, I don't see why you want any praying for. I need it bad. I've done lots of things that I hadn't ought to. Yes, but you've done lots of good, too. I was so glad, Tom, when you spoke up to Green. You know how to talk. That's what I've got a tongue for. But it was that falling tree that fetched him. He'll behave decently for a week, I reckon. Poor Alec looked as though he would say more, but words and courage failed him. He again caught his friend's hand, pressed it, then hurried from the dormitory with that indefinable expression which Tom had noticed before. Tom continued sitting on his bed for some moments longer. I didn't know that Alex Jones, he soliloquized as he rose. I thought he was a little girl. But he's a mighty good girl, anyhow. And with a grin on his face at this joke, he left the dormitory.